Unit 6. Annie of the Green Gables. Section 1. Marilla makes up her mind. When 11-year-old orphan Annie Shirley arrives at the home of middle-aged siblings, Marilla and Matthew, she soon changes their world. Read about how she accidentally comes into their lives. Scene 1. Narrator. Mrs. Spencer lived in a big yellow house at White Sands Cove. She came to the door with surprise and welcome mingled on her benevolent face when she saw Marilla. Mrs. Spencer. Dear, dear, you are the last folks I was looking for today. But I'm real glad to see you. You'll put your horse in? How are you, Annie? Annie, grumpily. I'm as well as can be expected, thank you. Marilla. I suppose we'll stay a little while to rest the mare, but I promised Matthew I'd be home early. The fact is, Mrs. Spencer's, there's been a queer mistake somewhere, and I have come over to see where it is. We sent word, Matthew and I, for you to bring us a boy from the asylum. We told your brother Robert to tell you we wanted a boy 10 or 11 years old. Mrs. Spencer, distressfully. Marilla Goodbirth? You don't say so. Why, Robert sent a word down by his daughter Nancy and said you wanted a girl, didn't she, Flora Jane? Flora Jane, coming out to the steps. She certainly did, Miss Goodbirth. Mrs. Spencer. I'm dreadful sorry. It's too bad, but it certainly wasn't my fault, you see, Miss Goodbirth. I did the best I could, and I thought I was following your instructions. Nancy is a terrible flighty thing. I have often had to scold her well for her heedlessness. Marilla, with a sigh. It was our own fault. We should have come to you ourselves and not left an important message to be passed along by word of mouth in that fashion. Anyhow, the mistake has been made and the only thing to do is to set it right. Then we send the child back to the asylum. I suppose they'll take her back, won't they? Mrs. Spencer. I suppose so, but I don't think it will be necessary to send her back. Mrs. Peter Blewett was up here yesterday, and she was saying to me how much she wished she would send by me for a little girl to help her. Mrs. Peter has a large family, you know, and she finds it hard to get help. Annie will be the very girl for you. I call it positively providential. Narrator. Marilla did not look as if she thought Providence had much to do with the matter. Here was an unexpectedly good chance to get this unwelcome orphan off her hands, but she did not even feel grateful for it. She knew Mrs. Peter Blewett only by sight as a small, shrewish-faced woman without any ounce of superfluous flesh on her bones. But she had heard of her. Terrible worker and driver, Mrs. Peter was said to be. Discharged servant girls told fearsome tales of her temper and stinginess, and a family of bad, quarrelsome children. Marilla felt a qualm of conscience at the thought of handing Annie over to her tender mercies. Marilla. Well, I go in and we'll talk the matter over. Mrs. Spencer. And if there isn't Mrs. Peter coming up the lane this blessed minute? Narrator. Mrs. Spencer bustled her guests through the hall into the parlor, where a deadly chill struck on them as if the air had been strained so long through dark green, closely drawn blinds that it had lost every particle of warmth it had possessed. Mrs. Spencer. That is really lucky, for we can settle the matter right away. Take the armchair, Miss Goodbirth. Annie, you sit here on the ottoman and don't wiggle. Let me take your hats. Flora Jane, go out and put the kettle on. Good afternoon, Mrs. Blewett. We were just saying how fortunate it was you happened along. Let me introduce you two ladies, Mrs. Blewett, Miss Cuthbert. Please excuse me for just a moment. I forgot to tell Flora Jane to take the buns out of the oven. Narrator. Mrs. Spencer whisked away after pulling up the blinds. Annie, sitting mutely on the ottoman, with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, stared at Mrs. Blewett as one fascinated. Was she to be given into the keeping of this sharp-faced, sharp-eyed woman? She felt a lump coming up in her throat, and her eyes smarted painfully. She was beginning to be afraid she couldn't keep the tears back when Mrs. Spencer returned, flushed and beaming, quite capable of taking any and every difficulty, physical, mental, or spiritual, into consideration and settling it out of hand. Mrs. Spencer. It seems there's been a mistake about this little girl, Mrs. Blewett. I was under the impression that Mr. and Mrs. Cuthbert wanted a girl to adopt. I was certainly told so. But it seems it was a boy they wanted. So if you're a little of the same mind you were yesterday, I think she'll be just the thing for you. Mrs. Blewett darted her eyes over Annie from head to toe. How old are you, and what's your name? Annie Shirley, and I'm 11 years old. You don't look as if there was much to you. But you are wiry. I don't know, but the wiry ones are the best after all. Well, if I take you, you'll have to be a good girl, good and smart and respectful. I'll expect you to earn your keep, and no mistake about that. Yes, I suppose I might as well take her off your hands, Miss Cuthbert. The baby's awful fractious, and I'm clean worn out attending to him. If you like, I can take her right home now. Narrator. Marilla looked at Annie and softened at sight of the child's pale face with its look of mute misery, the misery of a helpless little creature who finds itself once more caught in the trap from which it had escaped. Marilla felt an uncomfortable conviction that, if she denied the appeal of that look, it would haunt her to her dying day. Moreover, she did not fancy Mrs. Blewett to hand a sensitive, high-strung child over to such a woman. No, she could not take the responsibility of doing that. Marilla. Well, I don't know. I didn't say that Matthew and I had absolutely decided that we wouldn't keep her. In fact, I may say that Matthew is disposed to keep her. I just came over to find out how the mistake had occurred. I think I'd better take her home again and talk it over with Matthew. I feel that I ought not to decide on anything without consulting him. If we make up our mind not to keep her, we'll bring or send her over to you tomorrow night. If we don't, you may know that she is going to stay with us. Will that suit you, Mrs. Blewett? Mrs. Blewett, ungraciously. I suppose it will have to. Narrator. During Marilla's speech, a sunrise had been dawning on Annie's face. First, the look of despair faded out, then came a faint flush of hope. Her eyes grew deep and bright as morning stars. The child was quite transfigured. A moment later, when Mrs. Spencer and Mrs. Blewett went out in quest of a recipe the latter had come to borrow, she sprang up and flew across the room to Marilla. Annie, in a breathless whisper. Oh, Mrs. Cuthbert, did you really say that perhaps you would let me stay at Green Gables? Did you really say it? Or did I only imagine that you did? Marilla, crossly. I think you'd be better learn to control that imagination of yours, Annie. If you can't distinguish between what is real and what isn't. Yes, you did hear me say just that, and no more. It isn't decided yet, and perhaps we will conclude to let Mrs. Blewett take you after all. She certainly needs you much more than I do. Annie, passionately, I would rather go back to the asylum than to go live with her. It looks exactly like a gimlet. Narrator. Marilla smoothed a smile under the conviction that Annie must be reproved for such a speech. Marilla, severely. A little girl like you shouldn't be ashamed of talking so about a lady and a stranger. Go back and sit down quietly, and hold your tongue and behave as a good girl should. Annie, meekly. I'll try to do and be anything you want me, if you'll only keep me. Narrator. Annie returned meekly to her ottoman. Scene 2. Narrator. When they arrived back at Green Gables that evening, Matthew met them in the lane. Marilla from afar had noted him prowling along it and guessed his motive. She was prepared for the relief she read in his face when he saw that she had at least brought back Annie back with her. But she said nothing to him relative to the affair until they were both out in the yard behind the barn milking the cows. Then she briefly told him Annie's history and the result of the interview with Mrs. Spencer. Marilla. Don't fancy her style myself. I don't fancy her style myself, but it's that or keeping ourselves, Matthew, and since you seem to want her, I suppose I'm willing or have to be. I've been thinking over the idea until I've got kind of used to it. It seems a sort of duty. I've never brought up a child, especially a girl, and I dare say I'll make a terrible mess out of it. But I'll do my best. So far as I'm concerned, Matthew, she may stay. Marilla. It would be more to the point if you could say she was a useful little thing. But I'll make it my business to see she's trained to be that. And mind, Matthew, you're not to go interfering with my methods. Perhaps an old maid doesn't know much about bringing up a child, but I guess she knows more than an old bachelor. So you just leave me to manage her. When I fail, it will be time enough to put your oar in. Narrator. Marilla sniffed to express her contempt of Matthew's opinions concerning anything feminine and walked off to the dairy with the pails. Marilla. To herself. I won't let her tonight that she can stay. I won't tell her tonight that she can stay. She would be so excited that she wouldn't sleep a wink. Marilla Goodbirth, you're up fairly in for it. Did you ever suppose you would see the day when you would be adopting an orphan girl? It's surprising enough, but not so surprising as that Matthew should be at the bottom of it. Him that always seemed to have such a mortal dread of little girls. Anyhow, we have decided on the experiment, and goodness only knows what will come of it.